Look into those eyes. In the strobe light flashes of a midnight storm in Wyoming, the eyes of this creature are no longer those of a terrified wild animal. They are bloodshot from exhaustion, yet steady as a mountain rock. The mud is swallowing everything. The mountain is collapsing. A horse's instinct is to run, to fly far away from danger. But this stallion, he is doing the impossible. He anchors his hooves deep into the crumbling earth, using every ounce of his trembling muscle to brace against a massive fallen tree. Behind him, beneath the hollow of that timber, is the small, fragile cry of a child. Anyone witnessing this scene would ask one single question: why? Why would a creature once rejected by humans, beaten and priced like a broken toy, choose to stand his ground and trade his life for another? To understand this moment, we must turn back the clock, back to the day when his destiny was worth only a few loose bills, in a place where hope goes in, but never comes out. Welcome to Rock Springs. There is no cowboy romance here, only the smell of dry dirt, rusted iron, and the cold silence of death sentences left unspoken. Every year, the U.S. government performs a brutal but necessary task, herding thousands of Mustangs from the vast plains into holding pens. Why? Because the land no longer has enough grass for them all. These horses, the very symbols of American freedom, suddenly become trespassers on their own soil. In the darkest corner of pen number 4 stood a chestnut stallion. The number 402 was branded onto his neck with liquid nitrogen. He didn't stand tall. He leaned to one side, his shoulders covered in jagged, lumpy scars, bitter memories of survival battles in the wild that he had lost. The auctioneer's voice rang out, dry as snapping kindling. "Number 402, a Wild Mustang. Who'll start with the minimum bid? $125. The crowd looked at him and saw nothing but trash. A wealthy horse trader, his leather boots polished and arrogant, spat on the concrete floor and mocked the animal. He said the horse was broken and that buying him was just paying for a burial. Among the ripples of cruel laughter, there was another sound, the slow, heavy crunch of boots belonging to a man who had spent his life working the earth, Jim Miller. Jim didn't look at the horse's shaking legs. He looked at the long scar on the stallion's neck. He recognized that scar. It was the mark of a fighter who had struggled until his very last breath before being subdued. Jim's voice was rough and unshakable as he said, "I'll take him for $125. Beside him, his son Toby stepped toward the cold iron bars. In the midst of that hostile space, the boy's voice was clear as water as he whispered, "Dad, he's not a bad horse. He's just waiting for a name. I'm going to call him Maverick. Maverick, the one who doesn't follow the herd." As Jim looped the first rope around his neck, he could feel the heat radiating from Maverick's body. The horse didn't erupt in madness. He just stood there, breathing heavily, looking at Jim as if to ask, "What do you plan to do with the rest of my life?" Jim didn't answer with words. He gripped the lead rope and led Maverick out of the darkness of the auction. The sound of the stallion's thin hooves hitting the ground was dry and lonely. The crowd continued to laugh. They believed Jim had just thrown $125 into the trash. But Jim knew a secret that those traders would never understand. The value of a soul is not found in what you see, but in what it is willing to do when it is loved for the very first time. Maverick was loaded onto the old truck. The door slammed shut with a heavy bang. That was the sound of a scarred past closing, and the opening of a legend that, 20 minutes from now, you will not believe is true. The journey back to the Miller farm wasn't a victory parade. It was a silent, tense trek through the winding backroads of Wyoming. Every time the truck hit a pothole, Maverick's hooves would thunder against the wooden floorboards, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. When they finally reached the small, weathered ranch, the reality of what Jim had done set in. As soon as the trailer door opened, Maverick didn't walk out. He exploded. He was a whirlwind of chestnut fur and jagged muscle, leaping into the small paddock Jim had prepared. He didn't look at his new home with gratitude. He looked at the fences as if they were the bars of a prison cell. For the first 3 nights, nobody in the Miller house slept. You could hear Maverick screaming into the darkness, a high, piercing sound that echoed off the hills. It was the sound of a wild soul mourning a freedom that had been stolen by helicopters and sirens. Jim stood by the window, watching the stallion throw himself against the sturdy oak rails until his chest was bruised and his spirit was spent. To understand Maverick's rage, you have to understand where he came from. In the United States, the Bureau of Land Management is tasked with a nearly impossible job, managing over 80,000 wild horses on public lands. When the herds grow too large, they threaten the very ecosystem they call home. The result is what they call the gatherings. Mustangs are rounded up by the hundreds, separated from their families, and placed into holding pens. For a stallion like Maverick, who had once led his own band across the Red Desert, this wasn't just a relocation. It was a total collapse of his world. In the wild, a Mustang is the king of the horizon. They are bred by nature to be fast, hardy, and incredibly suspicious. To them, a human isn't a friend. A human is a predator that stands on high legs. Jim knew this. He knew that you don't break a Mustang. If you try to break them, you lose their spirit forever. And a Mustang without its spirit is just a shadow of a horse. Weeks turned into months. Jim spent hours every day just sitting on an upturned bucket outside the paddock. He didn't try to touch Maverick. He didn't try to saddle him. He just existed in the horse's space. People in town started calling the Miller Ranch the island of misfit toys. They laughed at Jim, saying he was wasting good alfalfa on a horse that would never be more than a pasture ornament. But Jim understood something they didn't. Trust isn't given. It's earned in the smallest of increments. In the world of the Mustang, they don't need a master. They need an alpha, a leader who is calm, consistent, and fearless. Jim would read the newspaper aloud, letting Maverick get used to the vibration of a human voice. He would toss hay a little closer to his feet each day. There were days when Maverick would charge the fence, teeth bared, trying to intimidate the man on the bucket. Jim never flinched. He remained as still as the Wyoming mountains. He was showing the stallion that he was a rock, a safe harbor in the storm of the horse's mind. The breakthrough didn't come from Jim's strength. It came from a child's innocence. One evening, during a violent summer thunderstorm, the power went out. The thunder cracked like a whip over the barn, and Maverick was losing his mind, kicking at the walls of his stall in a blind panic. Jim was grabbing his coat to go out when he noticed Toby's bed was empty. He ran to the stable, his heart in his throat. What he saw stopped him cold. Toby was sitting in the dirt, right inside the stall with the half-ton wild animal. The boy was leaning against the wooden slats, holding a tattered copy of a storybook. In the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, Toby was reading softly, his voice a tiny anchor in the howling wind. Maverick wasn't kicking anymore. The stallion was standing in the far corner, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear, but he was listening. Slowly, Maverick took a hesitant step forward, then another. He lowered his massive head until his velvet nose was inches from Toby's shoulder. And then, for the first time in his life, Maverick allowed a human hand to touch that jagged scar on his neck. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a 2-year-old war finally coming to an end. That night, the barrier between the wild and the world of men didn't just crack, it vanished. By the second year, the ugly Mustang had transformed. Under Jim's care and Toby's love, Maverick's ribs had disappeared under layers of rock-hard muscle. His coat shimmered like a polished copper penny. He wasn't just a horse anymore. He was the heartbeat of the Miller farm. He followed Toby like a giant protective shadow. He worked the fields with a loyalty that put the most expensive quarter horses to shame. Maverick had found a reason to stay. He had traded the vast, lonely plains for a family that saw his worth when no one else would. But Wyoming is a land that gives nothing for free. And soon, the bond they had forged in the quiet of the barn would be tested by the raw, lethal power of the mountain itself. A storm was coming, one that would prove whether Maverick was truly a broken reject or the legend he was born to be. Nature in Wyoming doesn't give warnings, it only gives signs. For 3 days, the sky had been the color of an old bruise, purplish, heavy, and weeping, a constant, relentless rain. The ground was no longer earth, it had become a saturated, unstable sponge. Up on the ridge behind the Miller Ranch, the ancient pines stood on a foundation that was slowly dissolving. Jim was busy in the lower barn, trying to secure the equipment. He didn't notice the silence. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind had held its breath. But Maverick knew. Inside his stall, the stallion wasn't standing still. His skin was twitching. His ears were swiveling toward the mountain. Thousands of years of wild DNA were screaming inside his brain. In the wild, a Mustang survives by sensing what the human eye cannot see. He smelled the ozone. He felt the vibration in his hooves, the deep, subsonic groan of a mountain about to snap. Suddenly, a sound like a freight train echoed from above, a low, guttural roar that shook the very foundation of the ranch. Jim ran to the door just in time to see a wall of gray mud and snapped timber tearing down the slope. "Toby!" Jim's scream was swallowed by the roar. The boy had been playing in the old creek bed, the one placed directly in the path of the slide. Jim tried to run, but the mud was already sweeping across the yard, cutting him off. At that exact moment, the sound of splintering wood exploded from the stable. Maverick didn't wait for a key. He didn't wait for a command. He threw his 1,200-pound frame against the heavy oak door of his stall, shattering the latch like it was made of toothpicks. He didn't run for the open plains. He didn't run for freedom. He charged straight into the path of the collapsing mountain. His copper coat was a blur against the gray rain as he leaped over fences and surged through the rising muck. He was no longer a farm horse. He was a force of nature returning to the fire of his ancestors. Maverick found him. Toby was pinned under a fallen cedar tree, his small body half submerged in the freezing mud. The slide hadn't finished. A second, larger wave of debris was surging down right behind it. What happened next is something Jim still struggles to speak of without his voice breaking. Maverick didn't just stand there. He wedged his massive shoulder beneath the fallen cedar, groaning as he used his sheer power to lift the trunk just enough for Toby to crawl out. But the boy was too weak to move. As the second wave of mud and rock hit, Maverick didn't flinch. He turned his body, positioning himself like a shield. He cored his hooves into the granite bedrock beneath the mud, bracing his neck and chest against the onslaught. Rocks bruised his ribs, mud blinded his eyes, but he stood. He was the anchor. He was the wall. He took every blow the mountain threw at him, his heart hammering against his chest like a war drum, refusing to let an inch of that debris touch the boy huddled beneath him. When the roar finally died down and the dust of the slide settled, the silence that followed was terrifying. Jim fought through the waist-deep muck, his hands bleeding as he clawed his way toward them. He found them in the gray light of the evening. Maverick was still standing, though his legs were trembling so violently he could barely stay upright. His beautiful copper coat was matted with blood and grime. But beneath him, tucked in the dry pocket of earth his body had protected, was Toby, unharmed. The boy was holding onto Maverick's foreleg, whispering the same stories he had read in the barn. When Maverick saw Jim, he didn't charge or shy away. He simply lowered his head, let out a long, ragged breath, and collapsed into the mud. He had given everything. He had held the mountain back until his family was safe. The neighbors who had laughed at the $1, $2, $5 bag of bones came the next morning. They didn't come to mock. They stood in silence at the edge of the slide, looking at the deep gouges Maverick's hooves had carved into the earth. They saw the blood on the fence posts where he had broken through to save the boy. They realized then that Jim Miller hadn't bought a horse at that auction. He had bought a guardian. Maverick survived, but he was no longer the same horse. The mountain had left its mark. Alongside the old scars from his days in the wild desert were new ones, badges of honor earned in the mud and the blood of that terrible night. For weeks, the Miller barn became a sanctuary. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Jim's worthless investment now lined up at the gate. They didn't come with jokes or mockery. They came with bags of the finest oats, with premium hay, and with a silence that spoke of deep, newfound respect. They looked at Maverick's bandaged legs and the exhaustion in his eyes, and they finally saw what Jim and Toby had seen all along. They saw a spirit that couldn't be measured in dollars or cents. They realized that the ugly Mustang from the bottom of the auction was, in fact, the strongest soul in the entire valley. Jim Miller often sits on that same upturned bucket where he once spent months trying to earn Maverick's trust. He looks at the mountain, and then he looks at the horse grazing peacefully in the sun. In a world that is obsessed with perfection, with shiny coats, pure bloodlines, and outward beauty, we often forget a simple, hard truth. The most valuable things in life are often the ones that have been broken and mended. Maverick was a $1-5 reject. To the wealthy traders, he was a bag of bones, but to a family in need, he was a savior. His story is a reminder to every one of us that your past doesn't define your worth, and your scars don't make you broken, they make you resilient. Loyalty isn't something you can buy at an auction. It is a fire that can only be ignited by the spark of unconditional love. Today, the gate to Maverick's paddock is often left wide open. Jim knows that Maverick is a Mustang, the son of the wind and the desert. He has the strength to run back to the mountains and never look back. He has the power to reclaim the wild freedom he once lost. But Maverick doesn't run. Every evening, when the Wyoming sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, you can see a copper flash in the meadow. It's Maverick, galloping with a strength and grace that defies his old injuries. But he always stops at the porch where Toby sits waiting. He stayed, not because of a rope, and not because of a fence. He stayed because he found something in that small, struggling ranch that the wild desert could never give him. A purpose, a family, a home. Because at the end of the day, a Mustang isn't just a horse, it's a legend. And sometimes, the greatest legends are the ones that no one else wanted.